This thing has always had a problem with loose steering, but after doing that alignment and then putting on the new tires, it makes it significantly more noticeable. And this thing kind of put the fear of God in me by sliding into that wall. This thing really just kind of goes wherever it wants. And even with that alignment, it's still really noticeable. It really just kind of wanders around because there's so much play in the gearbox. Now, I think I've made it pretty obvious that I like doing the work myself, and I haven't actually rebuilt the steering gearbox yet, so I'd like to. But because there is so much play in this one, I'm pretty sure it's gonna need new parts. And those parts, while not too hard to come by, end up getting a little pricey. So for reasons of price and practicality, and I don't know what I'm doing, it's actually gonna end up being cheaper and easier to just buy a remanufactured unit. I found one on Rock Auto for $70 plus a $50 core fee, so I can definitely live with that. Because right now I get a bit of a knot in my stomach every time I have to drive down a bumpy road, because this thing sure tries to go anywhere it wants to, and I'm not exactly a fan of that. A lot of the time the rag joint down here is actually the problem, but in this case it's not. The rag joint is actually pretty solid. It's all in the box. And there are certain adjustments you can do. You can adjust the gear mesh using this stud. If you screw it in too far, then the steering won't come back to center, or you could even lock things up. It's pretty much as far as it'll go before that'll happen, so that can't help me in this case. And the other adjustment is below this cover, you can rotate a lock ring to set the bearing preload and take some slack out that way. I've also already done that. It's as tight as I can get it. So either rebuild the gearbox or just replace the whole thing. The other benefit of replacing the whole thing is I don't really have another vehicle to drive right now, so I kind of need to be able to replace it quickly. So in this case, I figured just getting a remanufactured unit would be the best bet. So let's get to work removing the old steering box. First, off comes the splash guard. Then we'll remove the cotter pin and the nut holding the pitman arm to the center link, and then separating the two with a ball joint tool. With that separated, we'll go to the engine bay and pull back the plastic cover to remove the bolt holding the steering shaft to the steering box. I had removed the steering shaft before, but it was very seized up the first time and would not retract. Since I had cleaned things up and anti-seized them, it was easy enough to separate the steering shaft from the input shaft on the box. Then we'll go ahead and remove the return hose from the fitting and loosen the flare nut on the feed line so that it can also be removed from the box. A drain pan underneath will catch the fluid that drains out. Next, I'm going to unbolt the brake line from the frame so that we could push it out of the way a little bit to get the box out. The last thing to do is remove the 3 long bolts that pass through the frame that hold on the steering box. With those out, all we have to do is finagle the thing over the front frame crossmember and past the brake line. If you'll remember, I replaced this pitman arm a while ago, so we're gonna pop this off and reuse it on the new box. Sometimes it might be easier to do this while it's on the vehicle instead of taking it off, since it's bolted in and won't move around. But in this case, the four-wheel drive crossmember completely blocks this, so it's really tough to do it while it's on there. Ask me how I know. So we need to remember where the pitman arm is facing right now, because we're going to put it back on in that same direction. Right now it's centered and facing directly backwards at the steering column. These pitman arms only go on in 90-degree orientations, so as long as it's pointed somewhere over here and this is indeed centered, we should be fine. The input shafts on both are facing about the same way. This one probably got turned a little bit while it was coming off, but it's facing roughly upwards on the unit, so that should be good. We can attach a vice grip to the input shaft and show how much stop there is compared to the new one. You can see there's no movement of the output shaft when making small movements on the input shaft. While on the new one, any movement at all moves the output shaft. Just by design, these recirculating ball steering boxes will always have a certain amount of play at the center position, but at least on the bench, there is no appreciable play in the new box. It's also worth noting just how much less force it takes to rotate the new one. The old one, you really have to push on this vice grip, and this one, it's like you're barely doing anything at all. I'm guessing it's because I tightened up the adjusters so much on the old one when I was trying to remove slop. So one fitting looks pretty good, but I think I'm going to go ahead and clean up this one. It never seemed to leak, so the flare and everything should be just fine though. So we'll clean up this other power steering fitting. I can't even remove this line from the flare nut because they're so rusted together. So after cleaning this up, underneath all that rust, I found a hole. It's kind of impressive that I'm pretty sure this thing never leaked. Amazingly, the only thing keeping this line from leaking was the rust. And with this much pitting and everything, the only real way to fix this is to get a new one. Or instead, I could dig through the parts pile. This is the power steering hose that came on the engine that's now in the Blazer. So it's appropriate that we're gonna cut this off of there and use this as a return fitting. So we'll cut a small length off the end of this power steering line, smooth out the cut, and then remove the flare nut to use that one. Once everything is cleaned up, we reinstall the flare nut onto the steel line and use a flaring tool to create a small flare on the other end to hold on the return hose. I wouldn't use this method on the feed hose since that's quite high pressure, but the actual pressure on the return side is pretty low, so this setup should work just fine for us. And there we are. It's not the prettiest thing, but it's got a decent flare that should definitely be enough for that return line, and it will do the job. Now that we have this fitting done, and I test fitted already and everything seems ready to go, we're going to install the pitman arm onto the new steering box. What I'm going to do is put just a little bit of anti-seize on the splines and the threads so that if this thing ever has to come off, it's not going to be a huge fight. And we'll make sure we're putting it on in the right direction with the stud facing down and the arm pointing towards the steering column. And then we install the split lock washer, and we're going to reuse the pitman arm nut. And now I'm going to set this whole thing on the ground so I can stand on it and tighten this to the spec'd 185 foot-pounds. I had to get a little creative trying to hold the steering box still to torque down that pitman arm nut to such a high torque spec. So with all the parts ready, it's time to install the new steering box. Installation is the reverse of removal, so we'll finagle it past the brake line, get the pitman arm hooked into the center link, and install the 3 bolts to hold the box to the frame. Once all 3 bolts are in, we can torque those down to 80 foot-pounds. And then we can tighten down the castellated nut on the pitman arm to 40 foot-pounds. And of course, install a new cotter pin. Then, with a bit more wiggling, we can hook the steering shaft back up. Put a dash of anti-seize on the fitting, definitely not on the flare. A little bit of oil on the new O-ring. All we have to do is hook it up. Normally you want to use flare nut fittings, but I actually don't have one in 18mm, so I'll just be careful with it. Then we'll tighten down the return line fitting we made and reattach the hose. And this is still a very tight curve, but it doesn't feel like it's kinked anywhere. Then we just need to tighten that hose clamp on there. And we clip this back on. We have to bolt back on the brake line clamps and then fill the fluid and bleed it. If you remember, I replaced all these brake lines, so these are NiCop, they're nickel copper. They're very easy to just push out of the way. You still have the steel brake line there. You might have to unhook one side of it to get it out the way of the steering box. Either that or it might be possible to push it up and work it out some other way. Other than them being a little scary because of how soft they are, I really do like the nickel copper lines. After that, we'll bolt back up the splash guard and everything is back together. Before doing anything else, we'll fill the power steering reservoir with new fluid. You would normally want to flush out the whole system, especially if there were damaged seals or old fluid present, but in my case, in the process of removing and reinstalling this engine, the power steering fluid has actually been changed several times already, and the powered portion of the box was still working just fine, so I'm not going to bother. We'll jack it up so the front wheels are off the ground so it's easier to turn them. As soon as we start the vehicle, we want to bleed the power steering system. We'll slowly turn the wheel all the way to one side and then back to the other. You'll want to repeat this several times before checking the fluid level. Top it off and repeat this process until the fluid level is stable and you can't hear any more growling from the steering box. That growling is air in the system. Once everything seems good, we'll set the truck back down and go for a test drive. I drove the truck for a fair amount of time after replacing the steering box, and while the steering slop was definitely decreased, it still sort of tries to wander. It's really not dramatic anymore, but especially on the highway, it tends to wander left and right just a little bit, and it definitely has some bump steer. The remanufactured box seems to be working great, and I have no complaints about the power steering. So how necessary was this for us to do? Actually, not very, but it's all part of a project to get this thing driving as well as possible so I can start feeling safe in it again. Well, not safe, but safer. I really don't think hitting the wall had a big impact on the actual steering. I remember it feeling bad, and then I think I just kind of got used to it and I got complacent with it. And then after the crash, I couldn't stop worrying about it. So there's a real psychological component here. So mechanically, would the old box have been fine? Yes, I really think so. But for around $70 we've replaced it, and I think it was worth it both for the mechanical and psychological peace of mind. The only real way to fix this is to get a new one. I guess that was a little thin after all that rust, but it was worth a try.